Let us pick up a thread from what we were discussing in the history of genetics part 2 the other day. Mendel arrived at the arena of science and he had performed his experiments for a long period of 7 years, ranging from 1856 to 1863, and he very faithfully recorded the statistical data of all his crosses. In the year 1965, he delivered a lecture in front of the local audience of the Natural History Society of Brunn, and perhaps his lecture did not invoke any enthusiasm because it was a boring one, as the people say who have written their biography, his biography, and it was perhaps too full of statistics. He nevertheless published the classical paper in 1866, which was also not appreciated at all. The title itself was Experiments in Plant Hybridization, which did not give anything new as far as the title was concerned. As we have seen earlier also, this was sent to about 40 scientists all over the world. Most of them did not open the envelope at all because of the simple reason that the sender was not a scientist in his own right. He was just a monk, and that too belonging from a very, very downtrodden monastery, an unknown monastery of Austria. It was sent to Darwin. Darwin never bothered to open the envelope, but a scientist, a contemporary scientist, Carl von Nageli, who was working at the University of Munich, he read that paper and immediately came to a conclusion that there was something very, very interesting. But it is said that he was too arrogant, and he had two very important points against Mendel. Number one, Mendel was young, and number two, he was not a scientist. And therefore, after reading an unbelievable account of statistical nature, he immediately responded to Mendel and suggested him to work on some other plants as well. So Mendel's work was absolutely unrecognized because of various reasons. One was, of course, that it was an obscure journal, so people did not take it seriously at all, with very, very limited circulation. And then, as I said before, he was neither a biologist by profession, nor was he a member of any of the academia so as to cajole his colleagues to give a pat on his back. And more importantly, the statistical results were too complicated and incomprehensible to common biologists at that time. It would be sufficient to say that his work was much, much ahead of his time, and therefore it was very natural that it was not appreciated at that time. However, having said that, the real importance of Mendel's work was that he was against the whole idea of blending inheritance. He said that it was inadequate, and there was an actual transmission of discrete particulate units, of which even Darwin had no idea. So that means instead of emphasizing on the paradigm shift which was there from genetic transmission, he did not highlight that. He only talked about the principles from a statistical point of view, and these principles were really of not much interest as to if a purple flower is crossed with a white one, all the progeny are purple, and in the next generation they show some purple, most of them purple and some white. It was not enough to have any excitement among the scientific community. Another very important aspect which played a negative role and helped the oblivion nature of his work was that it was that time when Charles Darwin's Origin of Species had been published. And in fact, the whole scientific world was bedazzled and excited over how a new species is formed and what were the voyages of the Galapagos Islands, how did HMS Beagle move, and what is the survival of the fittest and the theory of natural selection. And therefore nobody really bothered as to if there are certain simple hybridization experiments knitted into statistical threads. So it is not that Mendel had worked simply or started work on Pisum alone. He had also initiated work on Enterrhinum and Melandrium, also on Mirabilis and Ziamase, but he did not get success at all. You should remember that these plants that I have mentioned are also very important ones, and they have played a very important role in the concepts of genetics also, because Enterrhinum itself has given us so many ideas later about the deviations from Mendelism. Melandrium itself was the first plant in which the sex chromosomes in plants were discovered. Mirabilis, of course, was the instrument for finding out cytoplasmic inheritance, and later perhaps the IOJAP genes. And Ziamase, of course, has been a very, very important material for the angiosperms as far as the genetics is concerned. So Nageli's suggestion was to Mendel to start work on a hawkweed, which is Heratium species. Now, Heratium is a member of Asteraceae, that is erstwhile Compositae, but however, unfortunately, it is full of apomixis. Mendel worked for about 6 years on at least 28 different species of this flowering plant, but never got results which were anywhere near to his famous 3:1 or 9:3:1 ratios. The idea was, now if we see, it was very simple. The plant was not responding in a normal manner at all, because in most of the species which were studied by him of Heratium, the embryos develop asexually, and that means they will be derived from the parthenogenic development of apomeotically formed unreduced eggs, and these eggs themselves would have 2n number of chromosomes. In such a case, the seeds of such embryos will give rise to clones. That means exact copies of their respective mother plants. So how can you get the same ratios if there is no segregation, if there are no two parents? There were just one parent in this case. So that means the expected ratios of Pisum sativum were never obtained. Mendel tried and tried, and he even wrote so many letters to Nageli, and every time after the discussion the conclusion was that unless we get the results from Heratium, we cannot attach any level of universality or even a law or a principle to this type of an observation. Anyway, in 1868, now Mendel was made abbot of the monastery with a lot more of administrative duties, and as a result his scientific research perhaps came to an end, and he also started keeping ill health, and finally he died on the 6th of January 1884. He died of a kidney disorder, uremia. Believe me, his death was as unnoticed as his research paper. There was even an obituary in the local newspaper which read as follows: "His death deprives the poor of a benefactor and mankind at large of a man of the noblest character, one who was a warm friend, a promoter of natural sciences, and an exemplary priest." So even in the obituary there was no appreciation of his scientific achievements because they were absolutely unknown. So Mendel on his own was absolutely convinced that the work he had done on garden P was of fundamental nature, and it was true. And this is documented by two very important evidences. There was a page in his diary which was found after his death, and a corner said, "My day will come." So that means he had a notion on that. And he is also said to have remarked to one of his younger monks, and this whole sentence has been archived. He says, "My scientific work has brought me a great deal of satisfaction, and I am convinced that it will be appreciated before long by the whole world." So he was absolutely sure of what he had done. Now the question is, how long? He had asked a question that it will be appreciated before long. How long? The prophecy was finally fulfilled after 16 years, when three scientists, we will not say accidentally, but then this is how the science attitude moves, the process moves. Hugo de Vries, the Dutchman, the famous Dutchman, Karl Correns from Germany, and Erich von Schermach from Austria. They were working independently and in different European countries, and they reached through their experiments somewhat similar conclusions as far as the Mendel's initial work and the principles or the postulates were concerned. And they got together, and they also started writing a joint paper for which they needed some earlier work, and they were surprised that there was a dust-filled paper by a monk, some monk called as Gregor Johann Mendel, 16 years earlier, and who had died. And this paper, when they read, they were flabbergasted. The work was done hundreds of times in more details, and perhaps, if not more, a few thousand times more accurately and statistically. So they published the experiments similar to Mendel's, because they were also geneticists in their own right. And when they read this paper and they saw the similar results, they were the ones who drew attention to Mendel's paper, and it was nice that they attributed the priority of discovery to Mendel. And Karl Correns was given the job of formulating the laws on the basis of Mendel's postulates and principles. He published them in a journal, Flora, which was being published from Graz in Germany in 1900, and the title was Mendel's Laws. This was in German, and this is the story for the rediscovery of Mendelism. But then the question arises, is the word rediscovery truth or a misnomer? Why don't we say that perhaps these three people exposed modern science to Mendel himself? Now that means Mendel's work was now finding some recognition, and most important of them was William Bateson, the scientist the Englishman who gave the term genetics himself. He read this paper, he finally translated it into English, and he was one of the most ardent supporters of Mendel. And then he was also responsible for the term, apart from gene, allele, zygote, allelomorphs, homo and heterozygotes, and so much of recognition now resulted in calling Mendel as the father of genetics. Now this whole story is one of the most inspiring legends in the history of modern science, although it may appear to you that in the modern world of automated gene sequencing and supercomputers, the story of a person patiently working for 7 years single-handedly with tools like just a pen and paper and some razor blades and a few newspapers, perhaps this seems like to be something like a fairy tale. But then one should really appreciate that it was this type of a work which was full of grit, perseverance, which led to the solid foundations of genetics that we study today. There must have been various reasons for Mendel's success, because it was not that the Pisum sativum came out of the world. It is very true that people like Kallreuter much earlier, and Knight and Gauss, these were the people who had earlier worked on Pisum sativum on similar lines. But then where did they falter? They considered the whole organism of the for the inheritance pattern, and this is where they faltered. Because if you take all the characters in toto together, then you are bound to be confused as to their patterns of inheritance would be really divergent, and because they had no idea of linkage or the genes which were close together, so the results never fitted into a statistical mode. So Mendel's approach was really very different and unique. Mendel's approach was in a quantitative terms about the traits, and he classified them into two contrasting categories. That means when he was talking about the nature of the seeds, the texture of the seeds, then he thought only about whether they are round or they are wrinkled, and he found that they were really of the contrasting type. Then he was not concerned whether what was the seed color, whether it was green or was it yellow or an albino. So he only concentrated on one character, one trait at a time, and he performed some very simple crossing experiments, and then he looked for any statistical regularity, and only when he got a regular pattern, then only he was able to suggest some general rules. In his own words, he wanted to determine the number of different forms in which the hybrid progeny appear. By different forms, he meant whether they were like the parents or whether they were different, and if it was so in either case, what was the percentage in the next generation. So that means what he wanted to ascertain was actually the numerical interrelationships between the parental generations, the progeny, and the future generations. So if we are asked to find out 5 or 6 important keywords or key points which really led to Mendel's success, was that he selected one trait at a time and followed its inheritance pattern. The prerequisite was that this trait should be sharply contrasting. That means purple, white, tall, dwarf, wrinkled, smooth, axillary or terminal. So that means he was then not bothered about the other aspect. He maintained very meticulous statistical record of all the crosses, and the ones which were a failure, he also just noted them down without giving any reasons thereafter. He selected only pure lines for pure breeding varieties. Now that's a very important point, because he was very finicky that the parent that he was taking for crossing would be pure. By purity we mean that there would not be any exception at all. When we say any, which means none of the exceptions were tolerated. That means he went on selfing the plants till all the characters which were he found were a deviation, they were all removed. And then when a plant bred absolutely true for that particular character for many generations, then he took that particular plant as a paternal or as a maternal parental generation. He crossed these particular varieties up to 4 to 5 generations and did not stop at just one generation to give a hypothesis or to assign a principle, because he wanted to be sure as to what is the pattern in the subsequent generations. Is it not that the characters which have been segregated again may come together? So he wanted to go on and on in generations to find out whether the same principle was holding true in the subsequent generations also. So he formulated theoretical explanations only after he had observed his success as far as his experiments were concerned. There were various instances where the explanation was not forthcoming at all, because there were many of the points where the crosses were not showing the desired pattern. So he did not give his idea on that, and he simply left them out. We will have a lot to say about this aspect when we come to linkage and the characters which were chosen by Mendel himself. However, the fate favors the scientific mind. The choice of garden pea itself was very, very lucky, and it really paid off. So there must be something very good about Pisum sativum being an ideal experimental material, because the pure varieties can be easily available within they were available in the monastery, so it was an easy experimental tool. The other point which was so very important is that the characters were easily distinguishable. You could see various plants which are having shades of colors of flowers. Now in this case, it's very difficult to say either this or that. So here in this case, the flowers were either purple or they were white, and there was no intermediate, although in the later genetic discussion we will find that there are intermediate polygenic inheritance also, but then that's a far issue. Then on top of it, this was a plant which was fairly easy to cultivate, and on top of it, it had a short life cycle. That means only a few months were needed per generation. No doubt, even with few months of generation, Mendel spent about 7 years. Can you imagine if he had started working on an animal which was say for example an elephant or a giraffe? Perhaps 1 or 2 generations would have gone by and Mendel would have been finished. Then, to be statistically accurate, any plant should give a large number of seeds, because if there are large number of seeds, that means there will be more and more of replicates. So the flowers are large in Pisum sativum. The flower is cleistogamous, it doesn't open, and it is bisexual. So that means autogamy is assured, self-pollination is assured, and in this situation there will be a least chance that any foreign grain can contaminate the corolla, and all he had to do is to just remove the keel petal and perform artificial pollination. So the easy manipulation of flowers was also a very important criteria, and on top of it, the hybrids are fertile. Heratium did not give good results because many of the aspects which I have just enumerated were simply not there. So just to summarize, here was a monk with peace and a monastery. Answers to most of the pressing questions were given by him, which were specially raised by Darwin. However, there was a mistiming of publication, so therefore no recognition in his lifetime. And finally, the formulation of laws only 16 years after his death and 34 years after the publication of results. This makes for an ideal account of what is called as a story of belated recognition. Thank you.